A nurse befriended an elderly woman, but one unexpected day left everyone speechless. The dawn in the neighborhood where Clara Morales lived always brought with it a mix of hopes and resignations. The noise of traffic was just beginning to wake the city, but in her tiny apartment, the sound of the kettle and the hurried footsteps of the young woman organizing her day could already be heard. She had no time to lose. The clock, striking 6 in the morning, seemed to be her eternal enemy, but also her only ally. She had grown up in a humble home, where poverty was not only an economic state, but a shadow that spread over every corner of her existence. Her mother worked as a seamstress, while her father, a good but submissive man, settled for temporary jobs at a factory that threatened to close its doors. Even so, there was one thing her parents never denied her: the importance of dreaming. For them, Clara was the promise of a better future, proof that despite the circumstances, effort could break chains. Since childhood, she had felt fascinated by the white coats she saw in hospitals whenever they visited a sick relative. For her, doctors and nurses were more than professionals. They were heroes capable of fighting the inevitable. She decided that one day she would be one of those figures of hope. Though deep down, she knew her path would not be easy. When she finished high school with excellent grades, she thought she had taken the first big step toward her dream of studying medicine. However, financial reality struck her with the brutality of a thief in the night. The tuition for medical school was exorbitant, a price her family could not afford even on their best days. The night she received her university acceptance letter, she couldn't help but cry. It wasn't from happiness, but from helplessness. Her mother, seeing her broken, tried to console her, but her words failed to fill the void in her chest. "Clara," her mother said as she stroked her hair, "maybe you can't be a doctor now, but there are other paths to get where you want to go. Sometimes shortcuts aren't mistakes, they're opportunities in disguise." That was when the idea of studying nursing appeared in her mind, like a spark igniting a dormant hope. It wasn't the final destination she had imagined, but at least it kept her close to her passion. The degree was shorter and more financially viable. Plus, she could work while studying to cover her own expenses. Clara decided she would not give up. The first months as a nursing student were a monumental challenge. The classrooms were full of young people like her, many of them struggling with their own adversities. But what set the young woman apart from the rest was her unbreakable will. There were nights when she studied until dawn and mornings when she could barely stand from exhaustion. During the day, she worked as a waitress in a downtown cafe, enduring the disdainful looks of customers and the humiliations of her boss. "Late again, Clara?" her supervisor shouted in front of the other employees. "If you don't care about this job, there are plenty who'd kill for your spot." She apologized again and again, holding back the tears that threatened to betray her. She knew she couldn't afford to lose that job, no matter how demeaning it was. Every bill she earned represented a paid tuition, a book purchased, one step closer to her goal. Despite the hardships, she never lost her humanity. Whenever someone needed help, whether a classmate or a colleague at work, she was there to offer support. There was something in her character that made her stand out, a warmth she couldn't hide, even on the hardest days. But that kindness wasn't always rewarded. There were those who took advantage of her generosity and others who simply ignored her. The lowest point came one night when, after finishing an exhausting shift at the cafe, she returned home only to find the electricity had been cut off. Her mother, ashamed, explained that she hadn't been able to pay the bill because the money barely covered food. Clara hugged her and told her not to worry, but inside, she felt defeated. That night, she studied for an exam by candlelight, fighting against sleep and despair. Despite everything, she kept moving forward, motivated by a mantra she repeated in her mind: "This is temporary. All of this will pass." And somehow, that thought gave her the strength to continue. The day she finally received her nursing degree, she cried like never before. It wasn't just a celebration of reaching that goal, but a release from years of sacrifice and pain. Her parents were there, hugging her proudly. For the first time in a long while, she felt that everything had been worth it. However, the joy was brief. When looking for a job as a nurse, she discovered that the job market was even more competitive than she had imagined. The hospitals and clinics where she submitted her resume always seemed to have the same response: "Thank you for applying, but at the moment, we don't have any openings." And, while they're too meritist, frustration began to build up, but Clara refused to give in. If there was one thing she had learned over the years, it was that perseverance always finds its reward. Finally, after months of searching, she received an unexpected call from a nursing home where she had applied weeks earlier. The voice on the other end of the line informed her that she had been selected for a 90-day trial period as a nurse. Though the salary wasn't high and the conditions weren't ideal, she accepted without hesitation. It was her first real chance to practice her profession, and she wasn't about to waste it. The day she started at the nursing home, Clara immediately noticed the oppressive atmosphere that reigned in the place. The other nurses seemed unmotivated, doing their work with a coldness that bordered on indifference. The patients, mostly frail, elderly people forgotten by their families, lived immersed in loneliness and abandonment. She felt a knot in her stomach at the sight of that scene, but she also knew she was there to make a difference, however small. Among the patients, there was one woman who especially caught her attention. Sitting in a wheelchair by a window, she stared outside with a sadness that seemed to have invaded every fiber of her being. She asked about her to one of her colleagues, who replied indifferently, "Oh, that's Doña Elisa. Don't even bother. She's a grouch. No one visits her, so she spends all day there staring out the window." Clara decided to ignore the advice. Something in the old woman's eyes reminded her of her own mother, a mix of strength and vulnerability that she couldn't overlook. From that day on, she made it her mission to approach the elderly woman, though, at first, she was met with cutting silence. "Good morning, Doña Elisa," she said one day with her characteristic smile. "I'm Clara, the new nurse. How are you feeling today?" The woman didn't reply. She barely turned her head slightly, as if acknowledging her presence, but having no interest in interacting. Clara didn't give up. Every day she tried to start a conversation, sometimes with small comments about the weather or anecdotes from her own life. Little by little, Doña Elisa began to open up, even if only with monosyllables or small nods. One afternoon, while adjusting the blanket covering the old woman's legs, Clara noticed something she hadn't seen before: a small chess medal hanging from a worn-out necklace. "Do you like chess?" she asked curiously. Her eyes lit up for an instant, as if that word had awakened a memory buried deep within her. "I used to play," the old woman replied, with a voice that seemed to come from a faraway place. That single word was enough for Clara to understand that she had found a door into Doña Elisa's heart. From that moment on, she decided to learn everything she could about chess, even though she had no idea how to play. That night, after her shift, the young woman walked to a second-hand bookstore and bought a small book on the basic rules of chess, along with a used board. She spent hours reading and practicing alone, imagining what it would be like to play with Doña Elisa. She was determined to bring back to the elderly woman a little of the joy she seemed to have lost. The next morning, she arrived at the nursing home with the board under her arm. When she saw it, the old woman raised an eyebrow, surprised. "I thought we could play a game," Clara said with a smile. Doña Elisa looked at her skeptically, but finally agreed. "Just one," she muttered. What began as a timid match turned into a daily routine. Clara not only learned how to play, but also discovered in chess a new way to connect with the elderly woman. During those games, Doña Elisa told her stories of her youth, how she had competed in national tournaments, and the sacrifices she had made to pursue her passion. Clara, in turn, shared with her her own dreams and struggles, creating a bond that neither of them had anticipated. The clock kept ticking. But in those moments, it seemed to stop for both of them. However, Clara didn't know that fate, like the pieces on a chessboard, was moving its pawns in a game that would change her life forever. The hours at the nursing home began to feel different for Clara. Since the patient had agreed to play chess with her, the young woman felt she had managed to open a small window in the old woman's dark world. The games became a sacred ritual that both eagerly awaited. During those moments, Doña Elisa regained something she couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was pride, maybe passion, or even, at times, a spark of joy. "Clara, you move the pieces like a child," she would say with a barely perceptible smile as she moved her queen with precision. "Who taught you to play?" "A cheap book." The young woman laughed, used to the old woman's sarcastic remarks. "Well, yes, and thanks to that, at least you're not beating me in 5 moves like before." Doña Elisa let out a brief laugh, a sound rarely heard in the halls of the nursing home. However, what Clara didn't know was that the connection she had built with the elderly woman was not going unnoticed by others. In a place where routines were monotonous and days repeated without surprises, Clara's small victories began to draw the attention of the other nurses and the staff. "What do you do with Doña Elisa that she's always so happy with you?" one of her colleagues asked during a break. "I just try to listen to her," she replied simply, as she stirred the coffee in her hands. "I think no one should feel forgotten." Her words weren't well received. Some of the more veteran nurses looked at her with skepticism and weariness. For them, the job was just that. A job that allowed them to pay the bills. Nothing more. "You'll get used to it," one of them said coldly. "Everyone comes here wanting to change the world, but sooner or later they learn you can't save everyone." Clara didn't respond. She knew she couldn't argue with someone who had lost hope long ago. Instead, she decided to redouble her efforts. If she could improve at least one corner of that nursing home, she would feel satisfied. The old woman had not always been the hardened woman who now sat by the nursing home window. During one of their games, she began to share fragments of her life, as if moving the pieces on the board also helped her move the memories that had remained trapped in her mind. "When I was young, I played chess in tournaments all over the country," she said as she moved her knight, threatening Clara's rook. "Really? You competed?" Clara asked, surprised. "Yes. I was one of the best. Not because I had innate talent, but because I was determined. Chess was my escape, my way of proving I could be someone." "And what happened? Why did you stop playing?" Doña Elisa fell silent for a few seconds. Her eyes, which had once shone when speaking of her achievements, seemed clouded with a sadness that could not be ignored. "I fell in love," she finally said, as if those 2 words summed it all up. The nurse didn't want to pressure her. She knew some wounds were too deep to be reopened suddenly. However, over time, Doña Elisa's stories began to flow more naturally. She had loved a man who, at first, seemed to share her passion for chess and her ambitions, but as the years passed, that relationship became a burden that eventually extinguished her light. "I gave up many things for him," she confessed one afternoon. "I stopped competing. I stopped traveling. And when I wanted to go back to it, it was already too late." He never said it directly, but he always made me feel that my place was at home, taking care of others, not chasing dreams. Clara listened in silence, feeling a mix of anger and sadness for that woman who had sacrificed so much, only to end up in a place where no one seemed to remember her. As the months went by, she began to notice something strange in Doña Elisa's behavior. Although they still played chess and talked as always, there were days when the old woman seemed more distracted than usual. Sometimes she forgot where she had placed a piece on the board or repeated the same stories she had already told before. "Are you okay, Doña Elisa?" she asked one afternoon, after the old woman forgot to move a piece for several minutes. "Of course I am," she replied with a forced smile. "I'm just tired, that's all." Clara wanted to believe her, but deep down she knew something wasn't right. She decided to speak with the nursing home doctor, who confirmed her worst fears. Doña Elisa was showing the first signs of dementia. "It's common in patients her age," the doctor explained in a clinical tone. "We can't do much more than keep her comfortable and try to stimulate her mind." The nurse left the office with a heavy heart. She couldn't imagine Doña Elisa, a woman so intelligent and strong, slowly losing her memories and her essence. Still, she decided she would not allow the illness to defeat her so easily. From that day on, Clara resolved to do everything possible to keep the old woman's mind active. In addition to chess, she began reading her books, showing her old photographs, and asking her to tell more stories from her life. Although she sometimes seemed confused or disoriented, there were moments when her lucidity returned, and Clara treasured those moments as if they were small miracles. The days began to take on a different kind of routine, one filled with deeper purpose. Clara always carried a recorder and a notebook with her, waiting for the moments when Doña Elisa was willing to share a fragment of her life. She had learned not to push too hard. Sometimes the old woman could spend hours in silence, her gaze lost in the horizon offered by the nursing home window, as if searching for something that no longer existed. At other times, a simple comment, or even a chess move, was enough to unleash a cascade of memories that filled the air with images of a distant past. It was on a Thursday when Doña Elisa broke the silence without warning, just as she was setting up the chessboard. The young nurse looked up upon hearing the old woman's voice, firmer than usual, yet heavy with unmistakable nostalgia. "I always wanted to be more than what was expected of me. Since I was a child, I was told what I should do, how I should behave, which dreams were allowed and which were not. I was the perfect daughter, the diligent student, but all within the limits of what was acceptable for a woman of my time." Clara set aside the chess pieces and picked up the recorder, turning it on without saying a word. Elisa noticed the gesture, but didn't seem to mind. She was too immersed in her own thoughts to stop now. When I discovered chess, something inside me changed. It was like finding a key that opened doors to a world where the rules were different, where gender, age, and expectations meant nothing compared to the power of a well-thought-out strategy. My father watched me play with skepticism, as if it were just a passing hobby. My mother, on the other hand, said nothing, but I could read it in her eyes. Disapproval, fear, perhaps even shame. Clara couldn't help but interrupt, intrigued by the story unfolding before her. "And how did you manage to compete if they didn't support you?" "Oh, child, it wasn't easy. I lied many times. I told them I was studying with friends or that I had school activities, but in reality I would sneak away to take part in underground tournaments or small gatherings where people played out of pure passion. It was there that I met those who taught me to perfect my technique. One of them, an older man named Julio, was the one who enrolled me in my first official tournament." The woman paused, closing her eyes as if she could visualize every detail of that memory. Clara quickly took notes, though she knew the recording would be more precise. "Julio was an incredibly patient man. He saw in me something I didn't even know I had. He taught me to think beyond the board, to anticipate not only my opponent's moves, but also the consequences of my own choices. Chess is life itself, he used to tell me." And he was right. Clara felt a lump in her throat at those words. She could picture a young Elisa, full of determination and eager to challenge the world around her, sitting before a chessboard with the same intense gaze she now reserved only for her most important games. And what happened to Julio? Elisa opened her eyes, but didn't look at Clara. Her pupils were fixed on some indeterminate point, heavy with deep sadness. "He died before he could see me win my first major tournament, a car accident. It was one of the first cruel lessons life taught me. Nothing is permanent, not even the people who support you the most." The silence that followed was so dense that Clara felt short of breath. She didn't know what to say. There were no words that could fill the void Doña Elisa had described so vividly. Instead of trying to console her, she decided to change the subject, allowing the old woman to step out of her memories. "And after that, did you keep playing?" "Of course, if Julio taught me anything, it was that the ones who really matter never leave you completely. His lessons were with me in every match, in every move I made. I won several tournaments, some even abroad. It was on one of those trips that I met Ramon." Clara didn't need to ask who Ramon was. She had heard enough in recent days to know that he was the man who, in one way or another, had changed the course of Elisa's life. He was charming, intelligent, ambitious, and as passionate as I was, or at least that's what I believed at first. We fell in love quickly, and before I realized it, I was setting aside my dreams to follow his. I convinced myself it was a temporary sacrifice, that I would play again once we were more settled, but that never happened. The young woman listened attentively, feeling a mix of anger and sorrow at the story unfolding before her. It was a story that resonated with many women of past generations, and perhaps even with some of today, the silent sacrifice of one's own dreams in the name of love or a misunderstood duty. "And did he ever regret asking you to stop playing?" Elisa laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was bitter, tinged with irony. Regret? No, Ramon never regretted anything. He always believed he was doing the right thing, that my place was by his side, not in front of a chessboard. And when I finally understood that he was never going to change, it was already too late. My life had passed, and I hadn't done anything with it. The weight of those words left Clara breathless. But before she could say anything, Elisa went on, with a strength she hadn't shown before. "That's why I want you to write my story, Clara. I want women who read it to know that it's never too late to pursue what really matters. I want them to understand that sacrifices have a limit and that no one, absolutely no one, has the right to extinguish the light we carry inside." Clara nodded, feeling a wave of admiration and respect for the woman before her. Despite everything she had lost, Elisa still kept a flame alive within her, a flame she now wanted to pass on to others. As the days went by, Elisa's stories became more detailed, more profound. She spoke of her triumphs, her failures, the moments when she felt she had hit rock bottom, and the small victories that helped her move forward. Clara realized that she wasn't just writing a story, she was helping Elisa heal, reconcile with her past, and find a new reason to keep going. But not everything was easy. There were days when Elisa refused to speak, trapped in the labyrinth of her own mind. On those occasions, Clara would sit beside her in silence, offering her company without asking for anything in return. She knew patience was her best ally, and that even in the darkest moments, Elisa always found her way back. One afternoon, while reviewing the notes Clara had taken, the old woman looked at her with an intensity the young nurse had never seen before. "I want this to reach the world, Clara. I want you to publish it, to share it with anyone willing to listen. It doesn't matter if no one cares about an old woman who used to play chess. What matters is that these words can change lives." The girl felt a lump in her throat, but nodded with determination. She knew she had a responsibility, not only to Elisa, but to all the women whose stories had been silenced over time. The relationship between the two women had evolved into a dance of trust and mutual learning. For Clara, what had begun as a simple act of volunteering had become a journey of self-discovery. Every word, every story the old woman shared was like a mirror, forcing her to reflect on her own life, her own dreams, and the choices she still had time to make. But though the bond between them grew stronger, she couldn't ignore that Elisa also had her dark days, moments when the weight of her past seemed to crush her. One of those days came without warning. She had arrived at the nursing home as usual, recorder and notebook in hand, ready to continue working on the story. However, when she entered Elisa's room, she found her sitting by the window, arms crossed, her face somber. Her eyes, usually lively and curious when she spoke of the past, seemed dimmed. "Today I don't want to talk," she said without even turning to look at her. Clara placed her things on the small table beside the armchair. She knew insisting would do no good. The old woman was stubborn and proud, and on days like these, the only thing she could do was keep her company in silence. She sat in front of her, watching the grey sky through the window. The rain-heavy clouds seemed to reflect the old woman's mood. After a few minutes, she decided to try something different. "You know, Yesterday, I found an old photo of you in the National Chess Tournament archives. It was from the year you won the championship in Mendoza. Do you remember that tournament? The old woman slowly turned her head toward her, her eyes showing a glimmer of interest. Of course I remember. It was one of the best matches of my life, but also one of the loneliest. She leaned forward, noticing how Elisa's words began to flow, though with a slower cadence, more laden with emotion. In that tournament, I was the only woman. Imagine that, Clara. A room full of men, all looking at me as if I were a glitch in the system. They didn't take me seriously. Some even made unpleasant comments, as if they were sure I'd be eliminated in the first round. And what did you do? She asked, trying to hold back her excitement. I showed them they were wrong, Elisa replied with a barely perceptible smile. It was the first time I truly understood how powerful I could be, not just as a player, but as a woman. Every move I made on the board was a blow against their prejudices, a way of telling them, I'm here, and I won't back down. She fell silent for a moment, her fingers playing with the edge of the blanket covering her legs. Then she continued, her voice softer. But at the end of the tournament, when they handed me the trophy, I realized something that hurt deeply. I was alone. There was no one there to celebrate with me. My family didn't even know I had competed. And Ramon, well, by then he had already started showing his true colors. Clara didn't know what to say. The image of a young Elisa, triumphant but alone, was devastating. Did you regret going? She shook her head. No, I never regretted fighting for what I loved. But I do regret letting the love I felt for Ramon make me forget who I was. Clara felt a chill. Her honesty was raw, heartbreaking, but also inspiring. She decided to take advantage of the moment to ask something that had been lingering in her mind since she first began hearing her story. And if you could go back? If you had the chance to make a different choice? Elisa looked straight at her, her eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and determination. I wouldn't change anything, Clara, because every mistake, every sacrifice I made brought me here. And though my life wasn't perfect, I learned lessons I can now share with you and with those who read my story. If I can prevent another woman from making the same mistakes I did, then it will all have been worth it. The nurse nodded, grasping the depth of those words. Sometimes, the true purpose of our experiences isn't revealed until much later, when we have the chance to use them to light the way for others. You know, Clara, there's something I haven't told you yet, she said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. Clara looked up, intrigued. When I gave up chess completely, Ramon and I had a son. She hadn't mentioned anything about a son before. It was as if that part of her life had been carefully hidden, kept in a corner of her memory. Elisa sighed deeply, her gaze once again lost in the horizon. He left. I haven't heard from him in years. When he was a child, I tried to be a good mother, but I think he always felt my resentment toward Ramon, toward the life we lived. When he grew up, he decided he didn't want to follow my path. He wanted his own freedom, and I couldn't blame him for that. There is Sov, Amata. The girl felt a pang of sadness. There was so much pain in Elisa's life, so many moments that seemed to have turned into indelible scars. Would you like to call him? Maybe you could try to reach out again, she suggested softly. She shook her head. No, Clara. He chose his path, and I chose mine. The only thing I can do now is make sure my story is recorded, so that one day, if he decides to look for me, he can understand who I was and why I made the choices I did. The rain fell, creating a melancholy backdrop for the conversation. Clara felt a mix of emotions. Sorrow for Elisa's pain, admiration for her strength, and a renewed determination to ensure her story reached the world. That night, as she reviewed the recordings and organized her notes, she couldn't help but think about her friend's words. Her story was not just a chronicle of triumphs and sacrifices. It was a reminder of human resilience, of the ability to learn and grow even in the midst of the hardest circumstances. As the pieces of the narrative came together, Clara began to realize that Elisa's story wouldn't just change the lives of those who read it, it was also changing hers. The young woman started to question how long she had been postponing her own dreams, how much of her life she was living out of inertia instead of genuine passion. On her next visit, she decided to share these reflections with the old woman. Elisa listened attentively, a gentle smile appearing on her lips. "That, Clara, is exactly what I wanted to achieve. My story isn't just for others to read. It's for you, and for everyone who hears it, to remember that there's always time to change, to pursue what truly matters. It's never too late to start again." The young woman felt her eyes fill with tears, but she held them back. She knew Elisa was right. And as the rain stopped and the sun began to peek through the clouds, the young nurse made a decision. She would not only write her friend's story, she would also begin to write her own. The connection between Clara and Elisa had become a profoundly transformative ritual for both. The young woman felt that every time she left the nursing home after one of their conversations, she carried a piece of Elisa's soul with her. Her memories, her sorrows, her victories, and above all, the lessons that emerged from it all. But the weight of those stories was also beginning to leave a mark on Clara, forcing her to confront truths she had been ignoring about her own life. Elisa had mentioned her son in their last conversation, and Clara couldn't stop thinking about it. What had happened between them to make them so distant? What did it mean for Elisa to carry that burden of guilt and resignation? The old woman was strong, yes, but Clara could sense in her a longing, an open wound that had never fully healed. It was as if, by telling her story, she was placing on Clara the responsibility of tying up loose ends she herself could not undo. When the nurse arrived at the nursing home that afternoon, she found Elisa in her favorite armchair, with a worn wooden box on her lap. It was small and covered in scratches, as if it had been opened and closed thousands of times over the years. Elisa caressed it with her fingertips, lost in thought. "Today I have something to show you," she said before Clara could even greet her. Her voice had a strange tone, part serious, part melancholic. Clara sat in front of her, setting aside the recorder and notebook. She knew this moment wasn't for recording or taking notes. It was for listening, for being present. "What's in that box?" she asked curiously. "The past," Elisa replied, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She opened the lid carefully, revealing a collection of photographs, letters, and small objects that might have seemed insignificant, but clearly carried great emotional weight. Clara picked up one of the photos. It was a black and white picture of a boy about 5 years old, with big eyes and a serious expression. "Is this your son?" she asked softly. The woman nodded, her eyes fixed on the photo. "Yes, that's Tomas. That's how he looked when I still believed I could give him everything he needed. Look at his eyes, Clara. Do you see how they seem to be searching for something? He always had that look, as if the world wasn't enough for him." The young woman studied the photo in silence, feeling the weight of her friend's words. "What happened between you two?" she dared to ask after a moment. Elisa sighed deeply, as if gathering the strength to answer. "The truth, Clara, is that I was an absent mother. Not physically, because I was always there, but emotionally, I was lost in my own problems. Ramon and I argued all the time, and I think Tomas absorbed more of that than I'd like to admit. When he became a teenager, our relationship became unbearable. He wanted to get away, and I let him go." Clara could hear the regret in every word the old woman spoke. "Did you try to contact him after he left?" "At first, yes. I wrote him letters, I called, but he never answered. And after a while, I stopped trying. I thought that was what he wanted, for me to disappear from his life. But that doesn't mean I ever stopped thinking about him. Not a day goes by that I don't wonder what he's doing, if he'll ever forgive me." The woman closed the box and set it aside, as if the act of opening it had drained all her energy. Clara realized Elisa had reached the limit of what she was willing to share that day, but the conversation planted a seed in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about Tomas, about the void he had left in Elisa's life, and whether there was some way to help close that gap. That night, she made a decision. Although her role was to document Elisa's story, she felt she couldn't ignore the emotional weight of this chapter in her life. She decided to investigate more about Tomas, even though she didn't know where to start. She knew Elisa had no contact with him, but maybe someone at the nursing home might have additional information. The next day, the nurse spoke with one of her colleagues, a kind woman named Carmen, who always seemed to know everything. Carmen recalled having heard Elisa mention her son in past conversations and told her that, according to Elisa, Tomas lived in another city, probably Buenos Aires. It was a vague clue, but Clara considered it a starting point. Over the following weeks, she divided her time between her visits with Elisa and her search for information about Tomas. She contacted chess associations in Buenos Aires, hoping that maybe Tomas had inherited his mother's love for the game. She also used social media and online forums, leaving discreet messages in search of someone who might have news of him. Meanwhile, her sessions with Elisa continued, but she noticed something had changed. Elisa seemed more withdrawn, as if the conversation about her son had stirred old wounds that weren't ready to heal. Even so, Clara persisted, encouraging her to keep sharing her story. Finally, after weeks of searching, Clara received an unexpected response. A man named Esteban, who ran a chess club in Buenos Aires, replied to one of her messages. "I think I know the person you're looking for," he wrote. "If it's who I think, he used to come here to play years ago, but he suddenly stopped coming. I still have his phone number. Would you like me to contact him?" Clara's heart raced. This was the opportunity she had been hoping for, but she also knew she had to be cautious. She replied to Esteban, thanking him and asking him to explain the situation to Tomas before sharing any information. She didn't want to impose or cause problems, but she felt she had to try. A few days later, she received a call. When she answered, she heard a male voice on the other end of the line. "Are you Clara? I was told you've been looking for information about my mother." She almost dropped the phone. The voice was calm, but carried a mixture of curiosity and distrust. "Are you Tomas?" she asked carefully. "Yes." "Why do you want to know about her?" The young woman took a deep breath before answering. "Your mother. She asked me to document her story. She wants the world to know who she was, but I also think she wants you to know. She didn't ask me to look for you, that was my decision. But I believe there are many things still unsaid between you." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Tomas responded, his voice softer this time. "How is she?" "She's fine, but I think she would love to see you." The conversation ended with a vague promise from Tomas to consider visiting his mother. Clara knew she couldn't pressure him, but the mere fact that she had contacted him already felt like a small miracle. When she visited Elisa that afternoon, she decided not to mention anything yet. She didn't want to give her false hope, but she also felt that something was changing, that the universe was beginning to conspire in favor of reconciliation. That night, as Clara reviewed her notes and recordings, she felt a new wave of determination. Elisa's story was not only a testimony of her strength and perseverance, but also a lesson about the power of forgiveness and the importance of second chances. She knew the road to reconciliation would be long and complicated, but she was willing to accompany Elisa every step of the way. And deep down, she hoped Tomas would be too. The news of having found Tomas marked a before and after in Clara's life. She couldn't stop thinking about how Elisa would react if she learned that her son was alive, aware of her existence, and, though distant, willing to hear about her. But she also knew that any misstep could destroy that fragile possibility of reconciliation. That's why she decided to handle the situation with the utmost delicacy. The days that followed were filled with emotional tension for her. During her visits to the nursing home, she watched Elisa with new eyes, analyzing every gesture and every word for clues that might help her understand how to prepare the ground for what was to come. Elisa, for her part, seemed oblivious to Clara's whirlwind of thoughts and continued sharing fragments of her story with the same mixture of nostalgia and resignation that had characterized her from the beginning. On one of those visits, while listening to Elisa talk about a particularly memorable chess match against an opponent she described as relentless but fair, Clara dared to test the waters. "Have you ever thought about what you would do if you could see Tomas again?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Elisa stopped talking and lowered her gaze, her face suddenly somber. "I don't know," she replied, after a long silence. "Maybe ask for his forgiveness, or maybe just hug him. But I don't think that will happen, Clara. Some doors, once they close, can't be opened again." Clara wanted to tell her she wasn't so sure of that, but she held back. It still wasn't the right time. Instead, she took Elisa's hand and said, "Sometimes doors just need a little patience to open again." That night, she decided to call Tomas once more. She felt it was important to keep that line of communication open, even if she didn't know whether he would be willing to talk. To her surprise, Tomas answered on the first ring. "Hello, Clara," he said, his voice sounding more relaxed than during their first exchange. "I've been thinking about what you told me." "And what have you decided?" she asked cautiously. Tomas sighed on the other end of the line. "I want to see her, but I don't know how it will be. I don't want her to think everything is forgiven, because it's not. There's a lot of pain, many things that were never said. It's normal to feel that way," Clara said. "It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be sincere." After a pause, Tomas finally agreed to visit Elisa, but with one condition. He wanted Clara to be present. Tomas's decision filled her with a mixture of relief and anxiety. She knew this meeting would be a crucial moment, not only for Elisa, but also for Tomas, who carried his own wounds and resentments. The day of the meeting arrived with a heavy atmosphere in the air. Clara arrived early at the nursing home and found Elisa in her room. The old woman was especially cheerful that day, talking about a letter she had received from an old friend she had lost contact with years ago. The young nurse decided it was the perfect moment to reveal what had been happening. "Do you remember what we talked about regarding Tomas?" she began, sitting in front of Elisa and taking her hands. Elisa nodded, her expression shifting from light-hearted to serious in an instant. "Why are you bringing him up now?" "Because I found him," Clara said softly, watching Elisa's reaction closely. Elisa's face went from disbelief to astonishment, and finally to tears. "You found him? How? Where is he?" "He's here, in Buenos Aires," Clara explained. "I spoke with him, and he wants to see you." The words struck Elisa with force, as if they carried the weight of all the years of separation and pain. She covered her face with her hands and began to cry, murmuring, "I can't believe it. I can't believe it." Clara hugged her, letting the old woman release all those repressed emotions. When Elisa finally calmed down, she helped her get ready for the meeting. Choosing a scarf, she said Tomas had given her when he was a child. When Tomas arrived, it felt as if the whole world stopped. He was a tall man, with a serious face, but the vulnerability in his eyes betrayed the nerves he was feeling. He looked at Clara for reassurance, and she simply nodded, encouraging him to enter. Elisa sat in her armchair, her hands trembling slightly as she waited. When her eyes met Tomas's, there was a silence that said it all. Words were not enough to express everything both were feeling in that moment. Finally, Tomas took a step forward and said, "Hi, Mom." Elisa broke into tears, and after a moment's hesitation, Tomas stepped closer to hug her. At first, it was an awkward embrace, full of tension and restraint, but little by little, they both began to relax, allowing the moment to envelop them. Clara watched the scene from a corner, feeling she was witnessing something profoundly sacred. There was an energy in the air, a mix of pain, love, and redemption that was almost palpable. Elisa was the first to speak. "Forgive me, son, for everything, for not being there the way I should have been, for all the harm I caused you." Tomas interrupted her, his voice breaking. "I also have things I need to apologize for, but that can wait. What matters is that I'm here. We're here." The old woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I can't tell you how happy I am to see you. I thought this day would never come." The conversation that followed was long and emotional. They both shared memories, good and bad experiences, and began to rebuild the bridge that had been destroyed so many years ago. Clara left them alone after a while, feeling it was important for them to have that space for themselves. When she returned to the nursing home the next day, she found Elisa in a state of serenity she had never seen before. The old woman greeted her with a smile and said, "Thank you, Clara, for giving me the greatest gift anyone could ever give me." The nurse smiled, feeling that all the effort had been worth it. She knew reconciliation wasn't a destination, but a journey. Yet she also knew that Elisa and Tomas were finally on the right path. The day after Elisa and Tomas's reconciliation, Clara woke with a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in a long time. There was something deeply gratifying about reuniting a mother and son after years of silence and pain. However, she knew real stories didn't end with a simple, "and they lived happily ever after." The foundations of their reunion had been laid, but there was still much to build, heal, and understand. When Clara arrived at the nursing home that morning, she noticed Elisa in the garden, sitting under a tree in her wheelchair. The old woman's gaze was fixed on the horizon, as if processing everything that had happened the day before. In her hands, she held a small, worn photograph of Tomas as a child, the same one Clara had seen many times in the drawer of her bedside table. "Good morning, Elisa," Clara greeted with a smile as she approached. Elisa looked up and returned the smile, though this time there was a special glow in her eyes. "Good morning, Clara. Today, for the first time in years, I truly feel like it's a good day." The young woman sat beside her, letting silence settle between them for a moment. It was a comfortable silence, heavy with meaning, as if no words were needed to express what they were feeling. But eventually, curiosity led her to speak. "How did you feel after seeing Tomas?" she asked, hoping Elisa would share her thoughts. Elisa took a deep breath and exhaled slowly before replying. "It was as if my whole world was rearranged. For so many years I lived with the weight of guilt and uncertainty, wondering if he was alive, if he was well, if he hated me. Seeing him there, hearing his voice, it was like a part of me that had been asleep finally woke up. But there's also fear, Clara, fear that it's too late to fix what I broke." Clara shook her head. "It's never too late to try, Elisa. What happened yesterday was a first step, and sometimes that's the hardest part. Now it's up to both of you to build something new without expecting everything to be perfect right away." The old woman nodded, though her expression was still clouded with worry. "He told me he still feels a lot of pain, and I understand. He has the right to be angry with me. But I also feel that, even if he tries to hide it, a part of him wants to forgive me. I don't know how to help him get there." Clara reflected for a moment before answering. "Maybe what he needs isn't for you to help him directly, but to give him the space to process his emotions at his own pace. Sometimes just being present and showing you're willing to listen can make a big difference." That afternoon, Clara decided to visit Tomas to make sure he was doing well after the reunion. She found him in his small mechanics workshop, a cluttered but cozy space where the smell of oil and metal lingered in the air. Tomas was working on an engine, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his face concentrated. But when he saw her, he set his tools aside and motioned for her to come in. "Clara, I didn't expect to see you so soon," he said, wiping his hands with a rag as he approached. "I wanted to know how you felt after seeing your mom," Clara explained. "I know it was an intense day for both of you." Tomas sighed and leaned against the workbench. It was complicated. I won't lie, there were moments when I wanted to run out. But there was also something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen before, that made me stay. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like, for the first time, she really saw me. Clara smiled. That makes sense. Elisa has spent a long time reflecting on her mistakes and longing for a chance to make amends. I think she's more prepared for this moment than you realize. Tomas nodded, though he still seemed uncertain. I suppose part of me wants to give her that chance, but another part keeps remembering everything I went through, and I don't know how to reconcile those two parts. It's a process, she said. No one expects everything to be resolved overnight. What matters is that both of you are willing to try, and that's already a big step. In the weeks that followed, Clara acted as a kind of bridge between mother and son, helping them coordinate their meetings and serving as mediator during the most difficult conversations. Each meeting was a small step forward, an opportunity for both to share their stories and feelings without fear of judgment. Although there were still moments of tension and tears, there were also laughter and shared memories that began to fill the void left by years of separation. One day, Tomas surprised Elisa by bringing her a box full of old letters she had written to him when he was a child. Many of those letters had never been sent, but Tomas had found them years later among the few boxes of belongings Elisa had left behind when they separated. With tears in her eyes, she began reading the letters aloud, recalling the moments when she had written them and the feelings she had poured into them. It was a profoundly emotional moment for both of them. And Clara, watching from a distance, felt she was witnessing a true act of reconciliation. Over time, she noticed that the relationship between Elisa and Tomas began to change. It was no longer simply a mother and son trying to mend a broken bond. It was a genuine connection that grew with every conversation, every gesture, and every shared memory. Elisa, though physically fragile, seemed to come alive again with each of Tomas's visits, while he, in turn, began to show himself more relaxed and willing to let go of the resentment he had carried for so long. Finally, the day came when Tomas invited Elisa to meet his family. Though she was nervous, Clara encouraged her to accept the invitation, reminding her that this was another important step in the process of healing and rebuilding their relationship. When Elisa met Tomas's children, her grandchildren, it was as if an entirely new chapter opened in her life. The children welcomed her with hugs and laughter, unaware of the complicated family history, and Elisa, with tears in her eyes, told them stories about their father when he was little. Clara, watching from a distance, felt a deep satisfaction in seeing how effort and patience had borne fruit. She knew the road hadn't been easy, but she also knew it had been worth it. As she stepped away to give Elisa and Tomas the space they needed to enjoy their renewed relationship, she felt that she could finally close this chapter of her own life with the peace of having fulfilled her mission. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of this story. I have loved sharing it with you, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Don't forget to subscribe and give it a like, so I can keep bringing you stories of kindness, love, gratitude, and hope. Leave me a comment if you liked it. I'm sending you a hug. And I'll see you in the next story.